I never thought I'd find myself working as a security guard at a cemetery, but my dwindling bank account and the promise of a decent paycheck led me to Nekropolis, a cemetery that I never knew existed. If it weren't for the ad I received while browsing the web, I wouldn't have found it. Clicking on the ad took me at the website that looked like something 13-year-old me would create as my first webpage. I quickly skimmed through their page and saw that they have an email I can contact if I was interested in any of the job openings. I sent them an email asking for an interview for the security guard role, and within 5 minutes, I got an email back saying they would like to interview me next week. I continued my life, almost forgetting that I had an interview if it weren't for the phone reminder I set it beforehand. I was thinking of finally having a job that pays well on the drive to the cemetery. I was convinced that I'd spend my time patrolling empty pathways and snoozing off in my guardhouse, all while getting paid. If it were that simple. Reaching the cemetery for my interview wasn't much of a hassle. The cemetery was located within a 20-minute drive from the almost devoid home I resided in. It was situated in a forested area of the small town I live in. After parking my car and reaching the front gates, I was met by a tall fellow with a wrinkled and aged face who went by the name Mr. Damien. He wore an elegant suit, black pants, black shoes, a bowler hat, and he held a cane in his left hand. He welcomed me to the cemetery and told me he was the owner of it and that it had been passed down in his family for generations. Even though he said nothing that sounded wrong, he, in a way, felt wrong. I sensed a creepy aura from him. Now, I'm not one to judge people, nor do I believe in intelligent life forms that are not human, but he felt off. He walked with a limp, out slowly with a heavy gasp for air in between words, and was devoid of expression. It's as if he was something, attempting to look and behave like a human, shrugging this off as him being weird. I mean, come on, the guy owns a cemetery. I followed him beyond the entrance gates. All the while, he asked me a few questions, all of which were ordinary questions you would expect in a job interview. We reached the end of the cemetery when he asked me the only question that stood out. Do you believe in the afterlife, Mr. Ingram? I was taken aback by this question, but I answered with all honesty. No, I don't, sir. He paused for a moment before nodding and holding out his right hand, which I shook. He showed me around the cemetery. It was guarded by a 7-foot iron fence, and there was only one way to enter or exit the cemetery, through the main entrance. In the middle of the cemetery stood 2 buildings. A small, old, and withered chapel, and a much larger and more preserved mausoleum. Inside the chapel is what you would expect. An altar, two ambos, a few altar crosses, many pews for seating, an organ, and a carpet that ran from the door of the chapel towards the altar, seated at the end of the chapel. The chapel itself looked ready to run down. The inside had gathered a lot of dust, and there were spider webs everywhere. It looked like it hadn't been touched since it was built. The mausoleum was different, was very clean, and I could tell it was very well maintained. It was a large structure. In the inside, sheltered many stone sarcophagus. They were all lined up in 3 columns, with each column housing a dozen caskets. A golden plaque was affixed on top of each of the entombments with the name, date of birth, and date of death buried on it. Outside the 2 structures were, as you expect, graves. Many looked old and withered, and a few looked clean and polished. A stone pathway revolved around a few areas of the cemetery. Finally, I was shown the place I was going to spend the majority of my time. The guardhouse. It was basically a small room with windows overlooking the entrance to the cemetery, the chapel, and the mausoleum. Inside the guardhouse was a chair, a table with a vintage radio on it, a clock on the wall, a jacket and coat hanger, and a door that leads to a small bathroom. Mr. Damien told me to enjoy the rest of my day, and that I would start my first shift later that night at 10 p.m. I got in my car and drove home to rest a bit before beginning my first shift. On my way back to the cemetery that day, I was a bit nervous. I wasn't scared. I had no reason to be. But it felt like I wasn't given enough information by Mr. Damon. On top of this, wasn't I supposed to sign any contracts or papers stating that I was now an employee of the cemetery? Anyway, I'd already accepted the job. Now it was the time to earn an easy paycheck. Or so I naively assumed. I reached the cemetery, where I was greeted by the security guard, whose shift had just ended. He gave me the keys to the chapel, the mausoleum, the guardhouse, and the cemetery entrance before wishing me luck. He even insisted that I would need it. I made my way into the guardhouse and found a piece of white paper on the table, and a security guard outfit still in the packaging right next to it. I took off the clothes I was wearing, put on my job outfit. I picked up the note and read it aloud. It said the following. Rule number 1. The cemetery closes at midnight. No visitors are allowed to enter after it closes. Once the clock hits midnight, walk around the cemetery and make sure that any visitors already inside the vicinity of the cemetery leave the area immediately. When a clock strikes 1 a.m., a tall, bald male with dark brown eyes and a white goatee will stand right at the entrance of the cemetery. You should let this man inside the cemetery without talking to him. His presence will not be felt, so he will not disturb you. Rule number 3. Between 1:15 a.m. and 5:30 a.m., you may hear an organ start to play from within the chapel. The lights of the chapel may also begin to flicker. Do not worry. You have no reason to be afraid unless you enter the chapel during this time. Rule number 4. You may hear noises from the mausoleum at any time during your shift. Do not approach the mausoleum during this time, no matter what noise you hear or how loud you hear them. They will eventually subside on their own. Rule number 5. At 2 a.m., you may hear knocking on the door of the guardhouse. Open the door, you will either be greeted by a weeping girl or a disfigured male. If the weeping girl was the cause of the knocking, escort her to the mausoleum, unlock the door for her, and make sure to lock the door after she enters the mausoleum. If it is the disfigured male who was the cause of the knocking on the door, close the guardhouse and lock it in the moment you see him. Either turn your head away from all the windows or close your eyes and wait until the knocking comes to a full stop. Only then you can resume your shift like nothing happened. Rule number 6. If the weeping girl knocks on the door and you hear noises coming from the mausoleum, let the girl enter the guardhouse instead and wait until you no longer hear any noises coming from the mausoleum. Then refer back to rule number 5. Rule number 7. Before 4:20 a.m. You are free to do anything while still abiding by all the above rules during that time. During this time, you will feel like you are being watched. At any moment, you might run into a few people roaming around the gravesites. If this is the case, avoid eye contact and don't interact with them at all costs. You are allowed back into the guardhouse by 4:50 a.m. Rule number 8. Enter the guardhouse by 5 a.m. At this point, you are not allowed anywhere else outside of the main room of the guardhouse, not even the bathroom. If for whatever reason you cannot enter the guardhouse before 5 a.m., run into the chapel and lock the door behind you. Inside the chapel, search for the bald man and remain close to him at all times. Do not talk to him or touch him in any way. Simply stay within conversing distance of him. They will not harm you if you stay next to him. Rule number 9. By 6 a.m., open the gates of the cemetery and wait for the next security guard to take over. Your shift is not over until the next guard arrives or until it's 8 a.m. Do not leave the cemetery until the next guard arrives or it's 8 a.m. Rule number 10. If no guard arrives by 8 a.m., you are free to leave, but not before you go into the chapel, where you will find the bald man from earlier. Tell him that your shift is over, but no guard has taken over yet. Once he acknowledges that, you are free to leave until your next shift begins. As I settled into my chair, I reread that note again and again. It can't be real, can it? It had to be some sort of prank. He left behind a last security guard to take over. Or by Mr. Damien. Either way, it was odd to say the least. They will not harm you if you stay close to him? Who are they? Why would there be people inside the cemetery after it closes? I thought about it for a bit before coming to the conclusion that I should follow these rules. After all, they may be testing me, seeing if I'm capable of following the rules they gave me. I sat in the guardhouse for about 2 hours before venturing out into the exterior of the cemetery. I did as the piece of paper said, and I made sure the cemetery was empty of all life, apart from me, before settling into the guardhouse again. I played with the radio, and to my surprise, the vintage radio crackled to life, emitting a static hiss that seemed to harmonize with the darkening atmosphere. I quickly turned it off, because the sound became too agonizing to listen to. From within the guardhouse, I saw a tall silhouette in the distance, right next to where the main entrance is. It seemed to be a person standing behind the gate outside the cemetery. I didn't understand why someone would want to access the cemetery at this time before I remembered the paper I read earlier. I picked up the paper again and read it, making sure to pay attention to every letter written on the paper. Rule number 2. When the clock strikes 1 a.m., a tall, bald male with dark brown eyes and a white goatee will stand at the entrance of the cemetery. You should let this man inside the cemetery without talking to him. His presence will not be felt, so he will not disturb you. I got up from my chair and headed out into the open. I couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that crept over me, like an invisible presence watching my every move. I made my way down to the entrance, and as I got closer, I could tell this was the same man the paper was referring to. Tall, bald, white goatee, black clothes, black gloves. He was taller than I expected, and his clothing made me think he was a gravekeeper. I nodded at the man as I opened the gate and let him in. He had his eyes fixated on the chapel the entire time. After walking into the cemetery, he hastily made his way to the chapel, where I saw him unlock the door and disappear into the darkness inside. To say I was scared was an understatement. At that moment, my heart was racing. I was sweating profusely. My brain was begging me to leave, that the job wasn't worth it. I felt like I was a dumb character in every horror movie who does nothing but make bad decisions all day long. Something felt wrong. He didn't blink. He didn't make a noise. It was like I was standing right next to a ghost. I shook off the feeling of dread, no matter how weird this may seem. The job was paying well. The minutes passed slowly, and the air grew thick with tension as I made my way into the guardhouse, making sure that both the cemetery gates and the guardhouse door was locked. I reread the paper again. I could feel the weight of the rules pressing down on me. It was as if the cemetery held secrets that I was forbidden to uncover. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the sound of an organ began to echo from within the chapel walls. I could hear it, even inside the guardhouse. Panic surged through me, but I fought to maintain my composure, leaving a mental note to myself to stay far away from the source of the haunting melody. I peeked through the windows to find the flickering lights outside the chapel, dancing like ethereal flames, casting an otherworldly glow that seemed to beckon me closer. I stared intensely, sweat forming on my brow as the music intensified, sending ripples of anxiety through my soul, as if something magical was transpiring within those walls. Suddenly, the guardhouse door shook under the force of a single hard knock, causing me to jump. I hesitated for a while before opening the door, dread gnawing at my insides. And there before me stood a weeping girl, her face streaked with tears, a sorrow that seemed to pierce my heart. Summoning my courage, I ushered her towards the mausoleum. All the while, the organ played a dreamy tune that resonated inside my head. We reached the mausoleum, and I quickly unlocked the door. As I stood by the door, I saw her figure vanish into the darkness of the structure. I quickly locked the door behind her, my heart pounding, mentally repeating the rules in my head. Then I returned to the guardhouse. The night wore on, each minute passing with agonizing slowness. Shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and the hushed whispers of the wind carried a symphony of voices that seemed distant, yet close. I fought to keep my wits about me, making sure to keep the piece of paper with all the rules on me at all times. As the clock approached 4:20 a.m., a shiver ran down my spine. I ventured outside, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching my every move, observing me as if they were a predator and I were their prey, waiting for the right moment to pounce on me. I thought I saw figures move among the gravestones, ethereal and haunting, their forms shifting like apparitions in the mist. Was it my head playing games on me? Or were there apparitions of some sort? I made sure to steer clear of any area where I thought I saw someone or something move. I returned to the guardhouse a minute before 5 a.m., feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I settled into my post, the clock ticking away the final hour of my shift. but the anticipation of what lay ahead gnawed at me. All the feeling of unease made me want to run back to my car and drive home. As the night grew quieter, the seconds stretched into minutes, and I heard the last of the organ. I sat at the guardhouse, unmoving, waiting for the time to pass. At last, 6 a.m. arrived, and I opened the cemetery gates, awaiting the next security guard to take over. Within 10 minutes, I was driving back home, awaiting my next shift. Nekropolis has a dark secret behind it. No one can tell me otherwise. The bald man, the haunting melody, the weeping girl, the moving shadows that I saw. They are real, and I will find out what they all mean in due time. But for now, I rest until my next shift is upon me.